Greetings from Swanee. I am Richard Apgar, Associate Professor of German Studies at the University of the South. I'm recording this presentation on our campus in southeastern Tennessee on lands that were the summer hunting grounds for people of the Cherokee Nation, the traditional custodians of this land who were forcibly removed on the Trail of Tears, a section of which passes nearby. I wish to honor their stewardship of this land throughout the generations. There are three sections to my talk today, which by virtue of this format is somewhat less formal than conference papers given in person. In the first section, I introduced the geographic context within which Goeckingk conceptualized the publication, and the form and contents of the Journal von und für Deutschland, which I'll refer to as either the journal or the journal from and for Germany. Second, I described the three elements in my dataset for engaging the multiple geographies present in the journal. These are drawn from advertisements published in other leading periodicals in 1783 and in elements of the journal from its first year of publication in 1784. In the final section of my talk, I share the locations from the dataset on a map. Visualizing the geography of the journal transforms the list of place names. Mapping makes plain the real and aspirational geography of this publication. In this final section, I explain the map shown on this slide. So please stick with me or fast forward to the final 3 or 4 minutes if your curiosity is piqued. I focus on a set of geographies in the journal from and for Germany. While there are certainly other geographies present in the journal, this paper draws on the publication's first year and argues that the multiple geographies embedded in its first 12 issues show the imagined, the real, and the aspirational reach of its print network. Beginning with Goeckingk's announcement for the journal, he describes the print landscape in Britain with a center in London toward which all manner of printed material naturally flowed. He writes, quote, "In London fließen die Nachrichten aus allen drei Königreichen ungesucht zusammen." In London, the news converges unsought from all three kingdoms. End quote. Like water flowing to a drain, London sits at the center of an imagined basin. News from the three kingdoms gathers unbidden. The writers, editors, and publishers of London need only reach out their hands and the news streams in, making itself available for dissemination. By contrast, he presents the print landscape of Germany as disjointed and without the same structures. The political condition of German territories, split into, quote, so many isolated states, end quote, limits exchange and association between these states, such that they, quote, know very little or nothing of one another, end quote. Where London served as a natural hub for collecting and distributing information, no single geographic spot can serve the same role in German territories. This lack of a geographic center, whether real or imagined, requires the construction of a network, the construction of pathways and routes to move information across the disconnected landscape. Through and across this network, as information moves, a shared or common identity will, Goeckingk implies, emerge. He's not alone in this sentiment in the late 18th century. Bois and Dome expressed similar aspirations for their periodical Deutsches Museum in 1777, and Sprengel and Forster likewise seek accounts from lesser-known parts of German territories in their Beiträge zur Völker- und Länderkunde, accounts on ethnography and geography. Let me step back for a moment to provide some information about the Journal von und für Deutschland. Inspired by the Gentleman's Magazine, a monthly published in London from the early 18th century, Leopold Friedrich von Goeckingk, poet, writer, and journalist who lived from 1748 to 1828, announced his intention in 1783 to produce a periodical similar to the Gentleman's Magazine, thereby joining a host of English and continental imitators who had done the same over the previous 50 years. As he wrote, the need for a journal from and for Germany was made clear to him while he traveled through German territories and realized how little knowledge was shared between them. To rectify this, Goeckingk, who had previously edited the Göttinger Musenalmanach and the Hamburger Musenalmanach, and authored several dozen articles in various publications over the previous decade, sought to capitalize on his professional connections to create an extensive network of correspondents, who would contribute both to its success and most of the material for each issue. Aware of the challenges of a monthly schedule, Goeckingk, who promised to avoid sending, quote, sand and stones to fill each issue, developed a set of 12 rubrics to guide correspondents' contributions. The journal's, quote, encyclopedically comprehensive program, end quote, to borrow Jürgen Wilke's summation of the project, relied heavily on the content that comprised the Gentleman's Magazine. Like it, the journal would have a meteorological diary, announcements of births, deaths, and marriages, awards and prizes from scientific societies, lists of plays produced on leading stages, indexes of goods available from new factories, and most importantly, for my purposes in this paper, a table of grain prices in various cities. To visualize the network that Goeckingk both sought and created, I rely on 3 sets of data drawn from the journal's first year. The first of these is the list of cities where he sought a correspondent. Second are the 4 grain price tables published throughout 1784. And third, the list of subscribers or cities where subscribers or subscriptions were sent, published in the January 1784 issue. The first of these elements, first element of these data sets is the network of correspondence. Goeckingk set out to recruit a robust cohort of collaborators. Repeatedly in his advertisements, he listed the cities where he sought a, quote, trustworthy individual to collect material for the journal. When he first published this list, on the left, it included 72 cities from as far north as Glücksburg in Schleswig-Holstein to as far south as Innsbruck in Austria, from Düsseldorf, Cologne, and Bonn in the west to Bunzlau and Stargard in current-day Poland. This list of cities represents the aspirational geography of the journal. It could also be said that this set of cities expresses the breadth of the from, in the journal's title. Goeckingk's success in recruiting collaborators can be seen in the significantly reduced list of cities named in the advertisement from 28 August 1783, which now featured 39 cities. Secondly are the grain price tables. Absent a list of identified correspondents, the cities that were included in the grain price tables serve as a proxy for the location of correspondents. These tables contain 54 cities. My belief that these cities were home to a correspondent is supported by their frequent appearance in the Auszüge aus Briefe section of the journal in this and subsequent years. The cities in this group represent one part of the real geography of the journal, modeled after a feature in the Gentleman's Magazine. 1784 was the only year during which these tables were printed in the journal from and for Germany. They were discontinued because the information as presented was not terribly useful to readers. The absence of a standardized measure and significant fluctuations in the values of currencies made comparisons difficult. The second column in this table shows the type of measures, and the fourth column shows the types of coins or currency. Without a standard measure for volume, for instance, the Scheffel is the most common measure listed, but it ranged anywhere from 50 liters to 222 liters, which made comparison of these figures nearly impossible. Even further, the range of dates when the prices were found were often weeks apart. In the third column, you can see that the first dates are in late February and some dates are in early April. Lack of interest in this information was not the reason for ending this feature. Other regional publications printed similar tables. For example, the Schlesische Provinzialblätter, the Silesian provincial papers, which was first issued in 1785, printed tables of grains over the course of its existence. Other regional publications like the Schleswig-Holsteinische Blätter and the Lausitzische Monatsschrift provided readers similar tables. Goeckingk's effort to provide this information on a national scale ran up against the limits of his aspirations. In this case, the journal offered reports from a geographic expanse that extended from Kiel in the north to Salzburg in the south, and from places along the Rhine River in the west to cities in Silesia in the east. Geographically, this data fulfilled the promise of the titles von. Missing, however, were key elements of the infrastructure that would make this data timely and easily interpreted. The third element is the subscriber list. This is the second part of what I'm calling the real geography. At the start of the journal's run, this list of 21 cities where the first issue would be sent was printed in the January issue. Many of the cities received multiple copies, and the announcement notes that many people had written directly to express interest in receiving a copy. In total, Goeckingk claimed that 195 copies were ordered. Even though the number of subscribers fell well short of the 600 he anticipated, Goeckingk launched the journal with the expectation that others would discover its quality. A sentiment that must have proved true, since the journal from and for Germany would appear at regular monthly intervals for the next 9 years. Turning in the final section to my map of multiple geographies in the journal, I switch over to a web browser and walk through the elements there. A first note, I'm happy to send the link of this map to you. It's not presently available on any website other than Google itself, but very hard to find. Beginning with the first element that I just described, the subscriber list of 1784 reveals the initial distribution of the publication. It's readily apparent that the reach of the journal at its launch is limited and very clearly centered around Erich, the city where Goeckingk lived and where he edited the journal. In its limited spread, it shows via the negative how aspirational the correspondent network that we will soon see truly was. Interestingly, except for Berlin, none of the other 18th century publication centers are contained in this subset, and other than the two university towns of Halle and Göttingen, the other cities where subscribers lived are much less prominent. Activating the cities found in the grain price tables brings a portion of the correspondent network into view. On its own, the set of locations is more challenging to interpret. Since I'm viewing this as evidence of a collaborator in these towns, I need to look more closely at Goeckingk's travels and his previous editorial work to determine if this assumption holds true. Since Goeckingk also claimed that he personally knew everyone in his network, which in the 18th century most likely meant that they had exchanged letters. The record of his correspondence at the German Literature Archive in Marbach might be an opportunity to gain further insights. Adding the cities that were listed in the 8 May 1784 advertisement, but not on the 28 August list, shows the full extent of the correspondent network in 1784. Taken together, these two sets include 87 locations. Imagine for a moment managing a list of 87 contacts as the correspondence piled up. Goeckingk gives some sense of this work through instructions for correspondence he transmitted through individual issues of the journal. For instance, he asked everyone to use a standard size sheet of paper for submitting their information. It seems some had been using scraps or were cutting their sheets to save unused portions for other purposes. In another, he detailed the post office through which collaborators in various regions should send their material. My assumption here is that he viewed these routes as quicker or more reliable than others. Looking at the coverage and dispersal of the dots on the map, the network of contacts, either receiving the publication or contributors submitting material, it covered surprisingly well the geographic expanse named in the journal's title. There are some gaps along the Baltic Sea coast, and the points are somewhat less dense in Bavaria than along the Rhine River Valley. Adding the final portion of the dataset to the map fills in some of these gaps, particularly around Dresden in Saxony and along the coast east of Lübeck. These yellow dots represent the places where our correspondent was still needed as the first issue of the publication was being compiled. In this sense, these dots represent the aspirational geography of the journal. This set, individually, has 39 locations, which would expand by roughly 50% the number of places in the full correspondent network. Goeckingk's prediction that in the future, quote, not much of interest might occur in Germany, which is not reported in this journal, end quote, is given form through this map. What was an alphabetical list of place names, many of which were unfamiliar to me, becomes a network that shows not only the aspirations for the journal, but also for the connecting power of print. In conclusion, in its first year, the geographic network of the journal from and for Germany started to create an infrastructure, a print landscape, if you will, that would compensate for the perceived and/or rhetorical deficit of the German media and news market compared to London and Great Britain. This network within the journal from and for Germany and the infrastructure on which it relied were far from stable. Nevertheless, they represent a medial and mediated attempt to gather a nation. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to our conversations in June.